Welcome back for another Naval History edition of the Proceedings Podcast. I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine. As timely as history can ever be, really. It was 70 years ago, as we sit here in late 2024, that the seeds of discord were sown in the South China Sea, and the U.S. 7th Fleet helped stave off the escalation of a full-scale international crisis, a crisis that may well have escalated into a third world war. That dangerous ratcheting up of tensions, of course, was the first Taiwan Strait crisis, and it continues to this day. It was the opening round of a tense situation that continues to this day and keeps the sinologists up late at night, worrying about the current geopolitical situation. So here to tell us about how all of this began that we're dealing with today is Lieutenant Commander Thomas J. Cutler. We're glad to have back in the magazine. Tom, welcome aboard.
Glad to be here.
So this is fascinating in terms of current events and the way history often can be. 7 decades ago from this very moment is when the situation the world is confronting now in the South China Sea really had its origins. And the whole thing could have gotten way out of hand then, and it's continued to simmer ever since. So why don't you set the table for us and explain the crisis in the Taiwan Strait of 1954.
Yeah, happy to do that. I think, the story actually begins earlier than that, back in 1949 when, actually after World War II, when that ended, the Americans actually gave to the Chinese Public Law number 512. And in that, they gave the Chinese 130 ships, turned them over to the then existing Chinese government, such as it was. And later, and the Chinese also inherited a bunch of ships from the Japanese, of course, when the Japanese surrendered, and the British threw in some ships. So as this came out to a total of about over 800 vessels for the Chinese Navy. Well, of course, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong go into a civil war trying to figure out who's going to run China, and this goes on for several years. But when Chiang Kai-shek is driven off the mainland and then retreats to the island of Taiwan and many other islands. That's one thing that's not always understood. There are many islands offshore China there, and the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek occupied those islands. They were driven to them because they were driven off the mainland. So the two of them were sitting there with, obviously Mao's got the better army because he's driven Chiang off the mainland, and Chiang's got the better navy because he's inherited this from earlier events. So that you wind up with this typical elephant versus whale thing we see sometimes in history. Other examples of this, the Peloponnesian War, where the Athenians were a naval power and the Spartans were a land power, and same thing with Napoleon and England. Same type of situation much later, in which case the two have these very powerful entities, but they can't get at each other very well because the army obviously can't get wet and the navy can't come ashore too readily. So that's where you wind up with this. So anyway, there's kind of a stalemate built around this. In the fall of 1949, the PRC, Mao does try, People's Republic of China, when I refer to PRC, under Mao, they attempt to take Quemoy, one of the islands that's less than 2 miles off the mainland. They try to take that island, but they fail. And again, remember, they don't have much, even though it's less than 2 miles, they can't, they're having some difficulty with the naval part of it. So then after that, in the following spring, 1950, they do manage to take Hainan Island, something they still control today. They do it, however, using a lot of small craft and so forth. They take very heavy losses, both in craft and personnel. But they do, in fact, manage to take Hainan. But the problem with Hainan is that it's one thing to take that island, the same kind of operation is not going to work to reach across the 80 miles across the South China Sea to get to Taiwan. So again, you've got this kind of stalemate thing going. Well, things take a turn, a new turn in June of 1950 when the Korean War begins, and that changes the whole complexion of what's going on in that part of the world. And as part of President Truman at the time, his response to the Korean War and the fact that you've got this stalemate situation among the two Chinese contenders, he comes out and issues a dictum and says that the Seventh Fleet is going to take up position between the two Chinas, between Taiwan and the mainland China, and patrol that area. But he makes it clear that they're there to not only to prevent the communist Chinese from attacking Taiwan, but to keep Chiang Kai-shek from attacking the mainland. He wants it to be kind of a stabilizing factor, instead of trying becomes a stabilizing factor rather than choosing sides, if you will. Even though we tend to lean more towards the nationalists at this point, we're trying to take this neutral position to keep the Korean War from expanding too much, I think is what we're looking at. Well, this is the start. Putting the Seventh Fleet there is the start of something that continues for the next 3 decades until 1979. There's a thing called the Taiwan Patrol Force, where we've got ships. Now they vary. At one time, there's like 7 aircraft carriers, believe it or not, in that strait. But another time, we're down to just a few destroyer escorts. But that patrol continues and continues for 3 decades. So now the Korean War, of course, ends. And at that point, we have a new president, President Eisenhower, and he continues the Taiwan Patrol Force, but now he changes the complexion of it by saying that it's going to be there to prevent the communist Chinese from taking Taiwan. I mean, to him, it seems kind of ridiculous that we're fighting the communist Chinese in Korea, have been fighting them in Korea, but taking this neutral stance in the strait. Now he says, no, it's no longer neutral. We're there to keep the communists on the mainland. So that changes the complexion a little bit. So then things begin to really unravel. This is really what I've been leading up to, the point that on the 3rd of September 1954, the communist Chinese decide to make a move. Now that Korea is over with, they've shifted a large number of their forces down to face the Taiwan Strait. And so they start shelling these 2 islands, Quemoy and Matsu. Sometimes if you're looking modern times, you'll see that Quemoy is called Kinmen, and even there's another name that pops up sometimes. And then Matsu, called Matsu back then, is often today called Mazu. Again, these are some of the Chinese and English differences. So they start shelling these islands, a very aggressive act. In doing so, there are 2 Americans, 2 Army Lieutenant Colonels, Alfred Mendendorf and Frank Lynn, who are there on Quemoy at the time and are killed. So these are 2 Americans that have become casualties of the so-called Cold War that's going on, something outside of Korea. And so that's not a good thing either. Well, anyway, this shelling continues for a long time, and it raises tensions tremendously. The U.S. Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles start talking about using nuclear weapons, believe it or not. Treating back then, you have to understand that nuclear weapons are treated differently than today. They looked at them more as just another kind of weapon, and didn't see them quite so differently. Eisenhower calls it another bullet at one point. So anyway, there's some threat going on. Well, then the Chinese start putting out information saying that, okay, if you attack us with nuclear weapons, Russia's going to retaliate, or Soviet Union, excuse me, Soviet Union is going to retaliate with nuclear weapons on American cities. So things start to get really hot to the point that Dulles says it's like living over a volcano. Well, this thing does not escalate into nuclear exchange, fortunately, but the shelling does continue. And the Communist Chinese start launching some airstrikes on these Dachan islands. Um, and these belonged to the Nationalist Chinese at the time. But Dulles and Eisenhower talk it over and decide that they're not worth, going to war over either. And they convince Chiang to actually abandon the islands, to evacuate those Dachshunds and give them to the Communist Chinese. And this is kind of a way of diffusing the situation. What takes place then is a thing called Operation King Kong, where about the Seventh Fleet steps in again, and this time plays an active role, not in combat, but in the evacuation, making sure that the nationalists are able to leave those islands without being attacked by the communists. They managed to extract 25,000 personnel and a whole lot of equipment through that Operation King Kong. Well, this kind of brings things to a head. As I said, things have calmed down because of this, even though it allows the communists to be able to claim a victory in the sense that they got their Dachshund Islands. We don't care about them strategically. They have very little significance, whereas, of course, Taiwan, Quemoy, Matsu, these do have strategic importance, and they are preserved. And ultimately, the Chinese back down, in essence, and stop shelling on the 1st of May 1955. So this has been going on for 8 months, that they finally stopped the shelling, and the crisis is kind of diffused at that point. So that brings us to almost to the present day, and that we're still sitting here on the opposite, trying to decide how this thing is going to play out, and of course taking a lot more modern aspects to it.
Yeah, and there was a second Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958. So this has just been percolating and erupting repeatedly since that time. And you mentioned Operation King Kong. I think it's worth pointing out what an amazing undertaking that was. 25,000 Chinese nationalists, weapons, ammo, combat gear, all taken to Taiwan with 70 warships, 7 aircraft carriers, and they pull it off without that's quite a feat.
It really is, yeah.
The 58 crisis was another flare-up. That's the second Taiwan Strait crisis. So we're now in a situation where it's almost more tense than it was even in the 50s, it feels like, don't you think?
Yeah. And again, these flare-ups continue even to today. I mean, we haven't had any actual shelling more recently, but we have had a lot of flyovers, exercises, a lot of pressure put on by the like when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, went to Taiwan. There was a big reaction, and then of course the Seventh Fleet interposes there and makes it's a game of cat and mouse, and make things more complicated too is back in what was it, December of 1954, we actually signed the Sino-American Defense Treaty, where we actually declared that we will defend Taiwan, and that stayed in effect for quite a while. But today has largely been ignored, forgotten, and we're sending mixed signals. As you know, that what is it called? Strategic ambiguity. This idea of, well, will we defend Taiwan? Well, recently President Biden has said, yes, we will, but the White House quickly comes back and says, yeah, but we still have this two China policy. It's a very confusing thing to try to sort out and to try to figure out what's going on. To make things, of course, worse, I think most of us are aware of the fact that the Chinese today have declared, Xi Jinping has declared that we are going to take Taiwan. I mean, this has been a constant policy. There's nothing new about this. We are going to take Taiwan someday. And he's getting more specific and throwing 2027 as a possibility and that sort of thing. So the whole thing is very ambiguous and has been for all this time. And if anything, it's gotten more ambiguous, I think.
And ever since then, it's been like the United States has been in a bag of angry cats, and we're still there now.
Yeah. Good way to put it.
So you're hearing the saber rattling about 2027. Navally, what would that look like? The Chinese offensive across the strait. I mean, that's a long chunk of water to cross.
Yeah, uh, and there's a lot of debate about that, and it gets into a lot of analysis of, one of the things that the Chinese are most likely going to rely upon is they've got a lot of large missile inventory, and I'm not talking about nuclear weapons, but conventional weapons, and they are likely to bring those in. Those can reach across the strait. Amphibious landing on Taiwan is a very uh, nebulous thing to try to predict. Whether the Chinese, a lot of analysts think that the communist Chinese, are not prepared to and may not be in the near future to pull that off. But then there are other analysts that say, oh, well, that's not necessarily true. And then the big question is, how do we, the United States, react to this? We're not actively, we don't have this active treaty necessarily, but we made it pretty clear that as an ally, we made it clear that the world without Taiwan as part of the, Western supply chain is a huge disaster waiting to happen. So the question is, how do we respond? And then the further question is, not only how does the government respond, but how do the people respond? Are the American people prepared to go to war with China over if they decide to invade Taiwan? I don't know the answer to that. I could make arguments on both sides of it.
Yeah, that's something you can't really predict. Um, on the one hand, there's the obvious populist sense of why would we spill blood and treasure at some island on the far side of the world? But so much of the world's economy transits through that body of water. And the other thing that's kind of the elephant in the room is Taiwan. It's not just its location; it's what's produced there. It's microchip central for the world, and nobody wants to give that up. And I feel like China is not going to want to blow it up just to say we finally took Taiwan. I mean, they want to get in there. They want to corner that market, if you will. So it's more than pride for them. I feel like there's a geostrategic underlying reason too.
Yeah, in most crises, most contests, you can almost always find an economic element, and certainly there's a huge economic element in this one. The fact that the economies of the contenders are so intertwined and so forth. So that's clearly there. But there's also another element. If you go back to Thucydides and the things that people go to war over: fear, honor, and interests. And all of these are playing here. And the honor part is the part that's very tricky, because the Chinese, for very good reasons, have got a chip on their shoulder. If you look back historically, they've been treated badly by the West. I think that very few people would argue that. The Opium Wars and all kinds of stuff we don't have time to get into, but the Chinese have been treated poorly, and their pride is hurt. And that you say, well, get over it. Well, that's easier said than done. And particularly the Chinese people, they have this vision of themselves goes way back, centuries. This idea of being the center of the universe and that sort of thing. So there's this kind of one of a better term, I call it a chip on the shoulder, but a justified one, that they are determined to make up for that in some way. And one of the ways is to take Taiwan. It belongs to us. It's always, they're thinking it's always been Chinese. It's part of our country, our nation, whatever how you want to define it. And I think that's an element that's hard to contend with. Trying to tell people that, well, get over it is easy to say, but not necessarily. You're talking about emotions and feelings here, which pertains to nations as well as people. So it's a complicating factor.
It is. It's because there's so many factors feeding into it. You're right. But what's really interesting is when you look back to the first crisis, it wasn't just that Mao wanted to take Formosa, Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Chiang Kai-shek wanted to regroup, get support, and retake the mainland.
Absolutely.
That pipe dream went both ways back then.
Sure.
Now it's more just the one side wanting to get in there and rectify what they see as history.
Well, that's true. I don't think that the Taiwanese have any great aspirations to take over mainland China. I don't think they would want it if they could it was given to them probably. But you're right that the dynamic has changed a lot in that regard. In some ways, that simplifies things. Before it was more complex because we were not only trying to restrain or prevent the communist Chinese from taking over, we were trying to restrain our ally from making things worse by attacking mainland China or something like that. So yeah, I think in some ways it's simpler, but then again, it's still very complex. No question about it.
The real irony of all this is when the rest of the world helped China open to investment, capitalism, the great sort of what's the word, paradox of China. It's the communist nation with a capitalist economy, so to speak, that's made them very wealthy. Incredibly powerful economy that's enabled them to build a navy that can be such a palpable threat. What if that had never happened? What if China had never sort of opened up economically to the West? I'm not sure there'd be such a tension point right now about all this. There wouldn't be this LA Navy that's so.
I think you're right about that,
growing.
and I'm sorry. I think we bear some responsibility. We being the United States. Um, I have to profess that I'm old, and I remember as a young man. I remember the Quemoematsu crisis. I mean, I was alive I was young. I was in grade school, I think, but I do remember it. It was in the news. I remember I had a good teacher who talked about these things. But at the time, I mean, to me, it was so obviously clear that the communists were the bad guys. I still believe that, and that the nationalist Chinese were the good guys. Well, there's some nuances there we could discuss, but the bottom line is that there was this Cold War struggle going on, and it was clear who was on what side. But then Nixon comes along later, and for other reasons, trying to change the balance of power with the Soviets and everything else, goes in and opens China. And there's been a great deal of all this wonderful thing that Nixon did. He opened China. I personally not so sure about the niceness of that for a couple of reasons. Number one, it just goes against my feeling of the good guys versus the bad guys that I have to deal with. But it's also more than that, because in opening China, we would help their economy, help them become part of the world economy. Sounds like a good thing, could have been a good thing, except for the fact that the Chinese are not willing to. The other idea was that by letting them join the world economy, they would also embrace things like democracy, human rights, that would follow. If you're going to be part of the world economy, you do these kinds of things. That part has never happened. We being the West, gave up Hong Kong, and the idea was, well, they'll be okay. They'll be on. Well, they're not okay. They're in terrible. Things are bad for the Hong Kong that were never supposed to happen in the optimistic view. So the same thing is going to happen to Taiwan. If Taiwan goes to communist China, I don't think anybody has any illusions that they're going to suddenly, everybody's going to kumbaya. It's going to be more oppression and so forth, and domination and that sort of thing. So I don't know. There's a lot, there's a lot going on here.
Right, in a sense, by enlivening their economy into a Western economic model, we sort of created the monster we now face, in a sense. Where does it all end? Everybody's wondering that. Half the pages of proceedings are often filled with prognostications about this, and sometimes it's fearful reading, to be sure. I love to do counterfactuals, Tom. You probably know that, and I'm going to invite you to indulge in one with me now. What if things come to a head when Ike was in power? What if he had used a limited nuclear strike, just to make a point? What if this global international crisis had not been staved off by the Seventh Fleet in 1954? On the one hand, we wouldn't be dealing with this right now. On the other hand, we might not be here talking either. So how do you think things would have unfolded just in that part of the world had it come to an actual head shooting-wise in 1954-55?
Well, it could have had a better ending, maybe, is one way of looking at it. The problem is that, what changes after World War II, I'm sorry, at the end of World War II, is the atomic bomb. This comes into this and complicates things so much. You can't just make decisions anymore in isolation. There always has this lurking thing: who has nuclear weapons and how might they use them, and what would be the effects of it. And generally, uh, it's not a good thing. And the problem is that the Chinese did not have nuclear weapons at that time, and therefore could not. I mean, we could have used them to good effect, if you will, militarily. But the problem is they were threatening and saying that the Soviets would come to their aid and attack American cities. Would they, or would they have done that? I don't know. Maybe not. The possibility they would not, but they might have. And in which case, then we've got a situation. Again, going back to that time, the Soviets did not have that much nuclear capability like they came to later on, and certainly have today, the Russians. Um, so yeah, when you're playing counterfactuals, there's so many angles that you got to look at. Um, but it could have been a happier ending, perhaps. It's a good possibility, but certain factors have to play the right way.
Yeah, and it certainly would have involved calling their bluff about the Soviets attacking the American mainland. Could they really have done that? I mean, even if they hadn't had the capability, they could have hit Guam, they could have hit Hawaii, something like that.
And
I mean,
yeah, I
yeah,
mean, we called the Soviets bluff in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that everybody that was a tense time, to put it mildly. And even
even
then,
tenser than what we're talking about. Yes,
yeah,
indeed. Of course, Khrushchev got something out of that too. We pulled our missiles out of Turkey, which is what
yeah,
we wanted in the first place. That
sure.
could have happened a little more under the radar, but yeah, who knows where this will end? But at least this shows about where it began. And you mentioned the year 1949. I'd like to go back to that real quick. It's sort of a prelude to all this. That was probably the worst year for the American public after
Mhm.
World War II. Everything bad kind of happened in 1949.
That's right.
First off, China falls to the communist sphere, and all of a sudden, a fourth of the world map is red now. And this is when there's a huge existential terror about the spread of communism. That's also the year Truman had to tell the public that the Soviets had successfully tested their first nuclear bomb years ahead of schedule. Fearful, fearful time indeed. And everybody was looking for communists under every rock at that point. It's in the tenor of those times that all this is taking place. So I think it's important to remember that too. What a tense period that was. We tend to look back on that post-war, late 40s into the 50s as kind of this idyllic American nostalgic time frame. But I think the people living then would not have felt that way. I think they felt like they could get blown up any minute. And it's easy for us to lose sight of the perspective if you were there then in the early 50s.
Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, and I lived through that period. I was in the sixth grade, but I was very aware of this, what was going on in the shelling of Quemoy and Matsu. Again, a good teacher who kept us up on current events and that sort of thing. But I was worried. I mean, where is this going? It was kind of scary. And that was, back in that time. So you're right. But 49 really was a bad year. Um, for the reasons that you said. When I teach war college class, and I often focus on that, I say, let's talk 1949 as we're talking Cold War and that sort of thing, and what a bad time it was. So you're right about that.
So that's interesting. You were grade school age, sort of mid 50s. Did you ever have to do those drills, those school drills, duck and cover, all those kind of things? Did you ever do those?
Yeah, we did. We did. In my case, we went down. I was in elementary school. We go down to the basement of the elementary school, and we would kind of hug the walls and cover our heads and so forth. And and it was, it was kind of scary, but we were young kids, and there was a lot of joking and laughing going on at the same time.
Mhm.
Some kids were scared. Others were kind of like, this is. We don't have to go to class right now. We can
Yeah, it's
play
fire
in the
drill. Great.
So it was a mixed reaction, as I recall. I don't have vivid memories of it, but I do have
Yeah.
some
Do
vague memories.
you remember having to watch the training films? Any of they show you those old training films? You can see those on YouTube, and they're pretty amusing, actually.
Yeah, I've seen them after the fact. I don't remember seeing them at the time, but
Mhm.
I've seen them after the fact. You're right.
Well, we live in tense times now too, and this is one of the hot spots of the world that keeps people worried. And people, if you ask most people, even just sort of mildly informed citizens, where do you think trouble could erupt in the globe? Where's the global hotspot that's most likely to blow up on us? I think a lot of people would say the South China Sea right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd be the number one pick, I think. Although sometimes the Russians make things a little scary too, and the Iranians, and we could go on and on. But you're right.
So let me see here. It's the 2020s, and we're worried and staying up at night worrying about what the Russians and the Chinese are going to do. That kind of sounds like the 50s. Are we stuck in the 50s again?
Full circle, right?
Yeah.
Because you got now to throw in the North Koreans who have their own nuclear weapons.
Right.
You got the Iranians who want to have them and have a lot of other nasty capabilities. So I don't know. It's not.
And they said it was the end of history a few decades ago. I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's for sure.
I'm glad I'm not the person who made that declaration, because this century has quickly proven that not to be the case.
That's for sure.
Well, let's hope that this remains a world of peace on earth and goodwill toward men here as we talk about these things right on the eve of the Yuletide. I love talking about this stuff with you, Tom. You're always a font of interesting information about these things, and your article explaining the first Taiwan Strait crisis should be required reading for anybody who's studying this part of the world right now. I highly recommend it to anyone out there who hasn't read it yet. Hopefully most of you have seen it. If not, it's online, or you should have your copy from the mail or at the newsstand. Great stuff, and can't wait to have you do another feature for us again sometime soon, Tom. Of course, Tom is a regular contributor to the magazine with his Profiles in Command column. Great column, by the way. So yeah, well, just real quick, do you have any other projects in the works right now you're interested in maybe putting out there? Or do you not want to think some? I can go either way on that kind of thing myself.
Sure. It's interesting that you should ask that question right now. Right now, I'm in limbo. And the reason is I just finished a biography of Ernest Evans, the tin can sailor's fame and so forth. And it focuses on Evans and his crew in ways that have not been done before, I think it's fair to say. I interviewed many of the crew, surviving crew, from the USS Johnson, who went down in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And as a result, I used some of those interviews in my first book on Leyte Gulf. But this time I'm focused purely on this one ship and how they perceived World War II as they went through. They only lasted a year from the commissioning to the sinking. But it gives a different perspective, I think. And also, I think it is inspiring when you read what their skipper did and what the crew did in support of him and so forth. Anyway, so enough of that commercial. But seriously, I just finished that, and now I'm looking. I can't not be working on something, and I'm kind of floundering right now, trying to decide where I want to go. There's all kinds of options to go for, so I don't know.
Well, that Evans book sounds really promising. What a true hero that man was, and that's one of the great David and Goliath stories in all of sea history, right there. Never get tired of recounting that or reading it.
Right.
I look forward to seeing that.
One of the points that I always want to make whenever I'm giving talks about it and that sort of thing is you can find other things in American naval history that might equal the courage that went into this particular moment in history, naval history. But I don't think you'll ever find anything that exceeds it. I mean, this is incredible stuff. And I'm not just Evans himself, but the crew that was there with him and so forth, and the other ships. Even though I'm focusing just on the Johnston, there were other destroyers, other pilots. It's a moment of incredible courage, and the Navy shines like it's probably, like I said, nothing will exceed it. I don't think ever. So anyway.
Well, I certainly look forward to that. Do they have a title yet for that book, or?
No, we had a title, but it turned out there was a problem with it, so we're floundering at the moment. So I don't know. It'll be something about Ernest Evans or U.S. Johnston, or we'll figure it out.
Okay, yeah. Well, will be looking forward to that. Hopefully, it'll be out in the coming year. Is that the plan?
Yeah, it'll be, in fact, it's due to come out in October. So
fantastic. Yeah. Stay tuned for that, folks. We're looking forward to that one. Well, Tom, I'm sure something will come up for you to write about, because something always does. There's that endless well of subject matter, and you've mined it quite wonderfully over the years and continue to do so. This latest contribution to the magazine is one of the best cover stories we've had this year, and I thank you for that. And I thank you for joining us again today. It's always good to talk with you, and we'll be seeing you around, I'm sure.
Okay.
That's it for us for today, folks. Thank you for joining us for another Naval History podcast on the Proceedings Podcast. And I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine, and I'll see you again next time.